Okay, so continuing from where we left off with this bank account and bank account demo, I want to go ahead and add a couple of additional methods to the main method just to be able to demonstrate how we can go about using our own custom classes, objects of those, as the parameters for a method, as well as the return value of a method. So I'm going to go ahead and create two additional methods. We'll do these one at a time. For this first one, we're going to go ahead and create it in such a way that a bank account is going to be the parameter for it. So we're going to do something like public. Let's do public static. This will not return anything yet, so we're going to do void, and we'll call this something like show bank account, or maybe show bank account will work. And then what we can go ahead and do is for the parameter, we'll just specify the type as bank account, and then we can call it something like let's say just ACC here. We'll do something kind of like a shorthand for account. Okay, and then what I want to go ahead and do is for this passed in bank account, I can go ahead and access any of the methods that are available with that bank account. So say for example, I want to go ahead and just get the balance that's inside of it. What I can go ahead and do is just take the code that I have right here. I'm going to go ahead and remove this from the main method and move it into this show bank account. I'm going to go ahead and cut that, paste it right there. And then right here, instead of keeping this code right here, I'm just going to go ahead and make a call to this show bank account method. So I'm going to have show bank account. And then what I need to pass into this method is going to be something that matches up with this parameter. So the one thing that we have inside of the main method that matches up with that is this bank account that we created up here. So we can go ahead and use this account. So I'll go ahead and give it that name. And so the way this is going to work is that we're going to make a call to the show bank account method. We're passing in the account, the object that we created. And so then right here, we're going to go ahead and access that account and then be able to do something with it. So I'll go ahead and compile this and run it. Okay. One additional thing is to change this to match the scope of this. So to make a quick note of this, since I'm using the parameter name is ACC, so the shorthand for account, I need to go ahead and make sure that that matches up right here as well. So go ahead and keep it like that, compile it, and then we will run it. And then we can go ahead and just specify each one of these values, same as we did before. So we can still give it an initial amount of 1,500, deposit something like 400, and then withdraw something like 1,000. And then we'll just go ahead and display this message dialog through that show bank account method. Okay, so go ahead and close that. And then the next thing I want to go ahead and do is create a second method here. This one's going to be used to show the ability to return a bank account object, so essentially returning an object to some custom class through a method. So do public static, and for this one, instead of specifying a return type of void, the return type here is going to match the class type that we have. So we're going to use a bank account, and then we'll give it a name of some kind. So for this particular one, I'm going to use this for this initial setup right here. And so we'll go ahead and use this and call it something like init bank account. So it's essentially going to be a method that's used to initialize a bank account. For this particular one, I am not going to specify a bank account initially. Instead, we're just going to end up constructing it within the body of this method. And so then what I'm going to do is include this line right here. We'll leave out the string. Although, let's see. Yeah, we'll need the string in both the main method and in this method. And we're also going to need this input dialog for providing the initial amount. So we're going to go ahead and just grab pretty much all of this code. So we'll just go ahead and cut all of that and place all of that here. But I will need to make sure that I keep this line in this method as well, since we're going to still use input right here. And so we're going to use the init bank account method to construct a bank account object. We'll go ahead and initialize our input string to be an empty string, and then we're going to use that to specify some some initial amount. And then at the very end, I want to just go ahead and use a return statement to return the amount that we specified here. Okay. And so then coming back up here, we have our initialization of our string input. The next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is just include a call to my init bank account. And then I also need to go ahead and create a variable to store this account that I'm returning from this method. So right here, in our bank account, I will keep the name the same as what it is throughout the rest of the main methods, which use account here. This is going to be equal to this init bank account. So the call to that method, just go ahead and do it like that. And so then we compile and run this. So we can go ahead and compile it without any errors. We'll run it. And then be able to specify our initial amount. So this initial amount that I'm specifying, this is coming from the message or the input dialog that's being displayed in the init bank account method. So we can put the 1500 there. So at this point now the object has been constructed and has an initial amount. So now when we get to this deposit method, it has gone through this call. We've stored the results of all that into account. So we've got that object with that initial amount of 1500. And then on line 11, this is where we're seeing this please enter the amount to deposit input dialog. So that's where we're continuing from here. So again, I'll just deposit something like 400 and then withdraw something like 1,000. And then this $900, this message dialog is being displayed through the show bank account method, which is right here. Okay, so this gives you a general idea about the flow of this program, which is starting at line 7, back in the main method. On line 9, when we hit this call to init bank account, we're going to go ahead and go through the code inside of that method, where we're going to construct our bank account object, initialize the amount that we want to put into it. At line 34, when we hit this return statement, we go back to the main method. We're going to finish up on line 9 by putting the results into this account object that we have here. And then we just step through the rest of the main method to get the deposit and the withdrawal. And then on line 17, we have another call to the show bank account method. So then we come into lines 22 and 23. Really just 22, kind of wrapping to the next line. We'll go through that to display this message dialog. I'll push OK on this. And at this point then it will go back to the main method. But since that was the last line in it, it hits the end of the main method and terminates the program. Okay. So that's going to cover everything for that. The one other thing I want to go ahead and address with this as well is going to be the more abstract idea about what's going on whenever we specify a parameter or return type as a class instead of, say, one of the primitive data types like int, double, float, char, or anything like that. So I want to make sure that we kind of understand the distinction between each of these two different kinds of method constructions. Okay, so coming over here, we'll go ahead and take a look at this. So imagine that the method itself is a box of some kind. So maybe this first box could be our main method, and then the second box that we have here is going to represent some other method. So generally, whenever you want to communicate between these two methods, if you're dealing with primitive data types, this comes in the form of taking a value that's in one of these methods, say going from the main method to one of these other methods in the form of a parameter of some kind, and the thing that you're passing into it is some kind of value. Right. So you're passing some kind of value, say in the form of an int, a float, or double. It's going to be some kind of number. In the form of a char, that's going to be a character. If you're dealing with a Boolean, it's going to be a value like true or false. That's what's going to get passed into this. Okay, so that's where the parameters come in inside of this. Alternatively, you could also have the opposite, where you're taking something from this method and sending that back to the main method. That's going to go back up to here, and that's going to be in the form of a return statement. So whenever you specify a return type for it, something other than void, you're going to have a return statement somewhere in your method, and that's going to return a value. So then up here, we have some value that we end up sending back to it. Okay. So this is a little bit distinct from the way that it works with classes and objects. So I mentioned before when we talked a little bit about declaring and initializing a primitive value or a primitive variable versus trying to declare the variable and then constructing the object for a class. I mentioned that the variable itself, if we were to look at that location in memory, the thing that we would find there is not actually the exact value of the object itself, but is instead a reference to the object which is located somewhere else in code. So that's generally what you're going to, what you should expect to see here as well. So if we again have the same idea here, then the one key difference is that instead of a value, instead of the object itself, when we deal with this, go ahead and create my two arrows. Then the thing that we're expecting to see here is actually going to be a reference. Place that there, and we'll place this here. And then right here we have our parameters. And over here we have our return statement. Okay. So as of right now, I won't be going into a lot of detail about precisely how to understand this distinction just yet. But one of the things to keep in mind is that because of the fact that this is a reference and not simply the value itself, there are some interesting things that you will be able to do to the objects if you pass them around to different methods, because of the fact that the thing that you're passing around is actually a reference to the object and not the object itself. So because of that, if we look back at what I have right here, keep in mind that when we construct the object on line 28, so account itself is a reference to this bank account object that we constructed right here. And when I do this return statement here, this is returning a reference to this bank account object. So then when I come up to line 9, the account that I've created in the main method, this is its own separate variable. So if we think about this, so we've got one account in main method, and we've got a second account in our init bank account method. So we've got two different variables that we've created, and what happens is this one object that we have, our bank account object, so let's just say our new bank account object that is located somewhere else in memory, this will now have two different references to it. We've got this reference to it, and we've got this reference to it. Okay, so depending on the way in which you implement the program, there are going to be certain instances where the fact that you've got two different references to the same object, that this might run you into a little bit of trouble. Because of the way that I've created this though, it's important to keep in mind that once we're finished with this init bank account method, when we call it right here, but then we hit this return statement and come back to the main method, all of the stuff that's going on in here is effectively going to be kind of tossed out or deleted. Once we are finished with it and come back to the main method, essentially this account, or this account that we have right here, we can effectively imagine that that's going to be removed after that occurs. So because of the way that I've set this up, we don't really have any critical issues with this, but eventually we're going to get into more complicated programs where this particular issue must be addressed. So it's important to keep in mind that there is actually a way to avoid this by making sure that whenever we have two different variables like this, that rather than having them both reference the same object, we can set it up in such a way that they might reference two completely distinct objects. Okay. So for the time being, we'll kind of keep this idea in mind. We'll address it in a bit more detail a little later on. And with this is also going to wrap up everything for Chapter 6 on this first look at objects and classes.